Hollywood loves to rewrite history. But when it comes to World War II, the industry didn't just bend the facts. It sometimes snapped them in half and set them on fire. The result? Films that disrespected veterans, erased allies, and turned real suffering into glossy spectacle. Ever wondered how far Hollywood would go to turn tragedy into a box office hit? Let's uncover the war movies that should make the studios squirm. Back to Bataan, 1945. Imagine taking one of the most horrific chapters of the Pacific War, the Bataan Death March, and reducing it to background scenery for John Wayne. That's exactly what Back to Bataan did. Instead of showing the reality, where thousands of Filipino and American prisoners died during a brutal forced march, the movie turned Wayne's Colonel Madden into the savior of the Philippines. Filipino resistance fighters? They were pushed to the side, portrayed as helpless villagers waiting for America's big hero to step in. The truth was far different. Groups like the Hukbalahap guerrillas had been waging sophisticated resistance campaigns against the Japanese long before any Hollywood colonel appeared. They had their own supply lines, command structures, and strategies. But none of that made it into the film. Why? Because American audiences in 1945 wanted triumph, not nuance. Studio executives knew patriotism would sell, even if it meant rewriting history. The timing made this propaganda even more powerful. With the war still raging in the Pacific, the film gave audiences a fantasy of American dominance, while silencing the reality of Filipino leadership. Historians have spent decades correcting the damage, reminding us that liberation wasn't delivered by Hollywood heroics, but through the blood and brilliance of local fighters. Back to Bataan wasn't just a war film. It was a distortion so blatant, it robbed real heroes of their story. The Battle of the Bulge, 1965. Few war movies commit crimes against geography, but Battle of the Bulge pulled it off in style. The real Battle of the Bulge took place in the Ardennes, a frozen forest where snow, fog, and bitter cold defined every move. But Hollywood shot it in sunny Spain, complete with wide-open plains, clear skies, and tanks rolling around as if it were a Western. Veterans who had survived the real Ardennes offensive walked out of theaters in disgust. This wasn't just a case of wrong location. The entire battle strategy depends on terrain. German panzers relied on dense forests, poor visibility, and surprise. The movie instead shows them charging across open ground in broad daylight, like some kind of desert cavalry. Military historians laughed at the absurdity. The tanks even pulled off maneuvers that defied physics, more suited to a toy commercial than a war story. The result was spectacle without substance. Real soldiers slogged through frozen mud, starving and terrified, while this film served up a sunny action. Blockbuster. The sheer disconnect between fact and fiction made it one of the most notorious World War II misfires. By swapping snowstorms for blue skies, Battle of the Bulge turned one of the war's harshest battles into a fantasy, and not even a convincing one. The Bridge on the River Kwai, 1957. Here's a film critics love, but survivors of the Burma Railway despise. David Lean's The Bridge on the River Kwai is remembered as a sweeping, Oscar-winning epic. But for those who lived it, the movie was a gut punch. Instead of showing forced labor, starvation, and resistance, it imagined British officers taking pride in building a bridge for their Japanese captors. That's not just inaccurate, it's insulting. Real prisoners of war did everything they could to resist. They sabotaged equipment, slowed work, smuggled medicine, and risked execution to keep morale alive. But the movie gave us Colonel Nicholson, obsessed with engineering perfection, a character invented for drama and prestige. Survivors who watched the premiere walked out, horrified that their suffering had been rewritten as cooperation. Even the climactic explosion of the bridge is pure fiction. In reality, those bridges stood until Allied bombers took them out from the air. No dramatic commando raids, no noble sacrifices, just relentless airstrikes and brutal survival. Historians like Julie Summers have shown how damaging this movie was, cementing myths while burying the true heroism of those who resisted from within. The bridge on the River Kwai remains celebrated by cinephiles, but it should come with a warning label: beautiful filmmaking, disastrous history. The Guns of Navarone, 1961. If you thought the bridge on the River Kwai bent the truth, the Guns of Navarone didn't just bend it, it invented a whole new one. This blockbuster wasn't based on a real mission. It wasn't even based on real weapons. The colossal German guns on that fake Greek island? They never existed. Yet director J. Lee Thompson convinced audiences that a daring Allied commando raid was a historical masterstroke. In reality, Allied operations in the Dodecanese were disasters. British forces suffered crushing defeats in 1943, losing thousands of men. There were no last-minute heroics, no giant fortresses to blow up, no mythical artillery controlling the sea lanes. But Hollywood replaced failure with fantasy, giving viewers a thrilling rescue that erased the real story of sacrifice and defeat. The film's composite geography made things worse. It stitched together bits of islands into a completely fabricated battlefield. Critics at the time shrugged it off, but historians point out that this fiction overshadowed the genuine horrors of the Eastern Mediterranean campaign. Lord Mountbatten himself admitted it was one of the war's costliest mistakes. The Guns of Navarone may be exciting on screen, but it's a war story without a war. And yet, it embedded itself so deeply into popular memory that many people today still think it's based on real events. That's how dangerous a good Hollywood lie can be. The Great Escape, 1963. Few movies are more beloved than The Great Escape. Steve McQueen's motorcycle stunts, James Garner's smooth-talking schemes, and Richard Attenborough's leadership made it one of the great war adventure films. But here's the kicker. Almost none of it happened that way. The real Great Escape from Stalag Luft III was a British Commonwealth operation. No Americans participated, but Hollywood rewrote the script, giving the glory to McQueen and his fictional American comrades. In reality, the escape was a masterpiece of stealth, not spectacle. Prisoners dug tunnels by hand, crafted disguises from blankets, and risked everything under cover of night. There were no dramatic shootouts or motorbike fence jumps. And the real outcome? Grim. Of the 76 men who escaped, only 3 made it home. The Gestapo executed 50 others in cold blood. But Hollywood didn't want tragedy. It wanted thrills. So the film turned a somber story of sacrifice into an adventure flick. Survivors and historians have condemned it for decades, arguing it buried the true cost of the operation. Instead of honoring the men who died, it gave us Hollywood stunts. The Great Escape remains iconic, but let's be clear, it's not history. It's a movie that glamorized tragedy, replacing careful planning and heartbreaking loss with motorcycle chases and movie star swagger. The Purple Heart, 1944. Some movies don't just distort history, they actively weaponize prejudice. Lewis Milestone's The Purple Heart is one of them. Released at the height of anti-Japanese hysteria, it painted Japanese military officers as cartoonish sadists, sneering monsters who existed only to torture American captives. Every character was stripped of human complexity. The film's courtroom drama wasn't entertainment. It was propaganda that fed into a climate where over 120,000 Japanese Americans were already locked away in internment camps. The timing is what makes this film so insidious. While audiences wept for the fictionalized Americans on screen, real Americans of Japanese ancestry were being forced to answer loyalty oaths, surrender property, and live behind barbed wire. The film's cruel caricatures gave people justification for those policies. It wasn't just a war movie, it was cultural reinforcement of discrimination. And here's the kicker. While based loosely on captured American airmen, the story was blown out of proportion, dramatized into a morality play where cruelty was exaggerated for emotional punch. The Japanese characters weren't soldiers. They were demons, stripped of nuance. Modern critics see the film as a perfect case study in how propaganda can harden prejudice while masquerading as entertainment. The Purple Heart isn't just outdated. It's a reminder that cinema can help justify injustice. Instead of just telling a story, it poured gasoline on real fear and suspicion, turning film reels into weapons of hate. The story of Dr. Wassell, 1944. Hollywood loves a lone hero, but in Cecil B. DeMille's The Story of Dr. Wassell, the lone hero wasn't just exaggerated, it was invented. The real Dr. Corydon Wassell was a U.S. Navy doctor who helped evacuate wounded men from Java in 1942. Admirable, yes. But in the film, he's transformed into a one-man rescue machine, carrying men through jungles, defying orders and saving the day single-handedly. Reality had teamwork. Hollywood gave us myth-making. In truth, Wassell was part of a coordinated effort with other doctors, nurses, and officers. The evacuation followed military channels and collective planning. It was dangerous, but it wasn't the swashbuckling fantasy DeMille presented. Critics at the time even noted how forced the heroics felt, with some reviewers openly skeptical about its accuracy. And then there was the portrayal of the enemy. Japanese forces were shown as bumbling caricatures, constantly outwitted by American ingenuity. This wasn't just lazy storytelling. It was wartime propaganda, designed to give audiences a morale boost by turning complex operations into comic book simplicity. The story of Dr. Wassell is a textbook case of how Hollywood reshaped wartime events into crowd-pleasing legends. The real doctor deserved recognition, but not at the expense of truth. In trying to inspire, the movie ended up distorting history into something barely recognizable. They were expendable. 1945. John Ford was a master of American myth-making, and in They Were Expendable, he aimed his lens at PT boat crews in the Philippines. The result? A film that turned one of America's most devastating defeats into a noble tragedy, carefully airbrushing out the logistical failures and command blunders that doomed those men from the start. It wasn't truth. It was comfort food wrapped in uniforms. The movie portrays PT boats as heroic, effective naval weapons. In reality, they inflicted little damage on the Japanese while suffering heavy losses. More importantly, the film erases the role of Filipino guerrillas, who carried on resistance long after American surrender. Instead, Ford presented the campaign as purely an American story, reinforcing the idea that U.S. sacrifice alone carried weight in the Pacific. The sanitized ending is the most glaring distortion. Instead of showing mass surrenders, starvation, and brutal occupation, Ford ends with a sense of quiet dignity, our heroes withdrawn to fight another day. That wasn't the reality. The fall of the Philippines was a disaster, marked by death marches and collapse. But Hollywood wasn't interested in defeat. It was interested in morale. They Were Expendable remains praised for its artistry, but beneath the craftsmanship lies a troubling rewrite. It didn't honor the truth of what happened. It gave audiences what they wanted to believe. The Longest Day, 1962. On paper, The Longest Day sounds like the ultimate war movie. An all-star cast, massive scale, and the story of D-Day. But in execution, it was more spectacle than substance. Darryl F. Zanuck packed the film with John Wayne, Robert Mitchum, Henry Fonda, and a parade of Hollywood legends. The problem? Their star power overshadowed the real heroes and diluted the complexity of the invasion into a sanitized action set piece. The film condenses months of planning into a neat, dramatic arc, erasing the chaos, miscommunication, and near disasters that defined June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach, one of the bloodiest battles of the war, was presented as manageable drama, stripped of its sheer horror. Tank maneuvers that would have been impossible on the actual beaches are shown for flair. Pegasus Bridge, executed with surgical precision in real life, becomes just another explosive moment. Even the leadership was warped. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr.'s actual heroics at Utah Beach were downplayed in favor of Fonda's celebrity presence. Countless junior officers and enlisted men who made critical decisions disappeared entirely. The result was a glossy epic that entertained but misled. The Longest Day remains beloved by fans of old-school war cinema, but historians are clear. It turned the most complex military operation of the war into a Hollywood parade. The invasion wasn't glamorous. The film was. The Battle of the River Plate, 1956. Naval battles are brutal. Screaming engines, twisted metal, explosions tearing ships apart. But you wouldn't know that from the Battle of the River Plate. Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger's film presented the 1939 clash between British cruisers and the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee as a gentleman's duel at sea. Officers exchanged polite courtesies. The fighting looked oddly civilized, and the real chaos of war was polished into something resembling sport. The sanitization didn't stop at style. Captain Hans Langsdorff of the Graf Spee was portrayed as a tragic, honorable figure, stripped of his role in serving a fascist war machine. By softening him, the film blurred the moral lines between aggressor and defender. Critics worried it created an uncomfortable equivalence, casting Nazi officers as just men doing their duty. And then there were the battle scenes. Explosions looked more like fireworks than catastrophic blasts. Real-life communication breakdowns, desperate maneuvers, and flooding compartments were replaced with neat, almost polite action. The scuttling of the Graf Spee, which involved complex diplomacy and pressure from multiple governments, was simplified into tidy plot beats. The Battle of the River Plate might look polished, but in doing so, it robbed the story of its stakes. It wasn't naval warfare. It was naval theater, carefully staged to make war look honorable instead of horrifying. Flying Tigers, 1942. John Wayne once again swoops into history and reshapes it to fit a heroic mold. In Flying Tigers, he plays the leader of the American Volunteer Group, the famous pilots who fought in China before the U.S. formally entered the war. On the surface, it's a flag-waving adventure about brave Americans saving the day. But scratch deeper, and you find an erasure of the very people the film claims to honor. The real Flying Tigers were indeed skilled, but their story was inseparable from the Chinese forces they supported. Without Chinese infrastructure, intelligence, and manpower, the AVG would have been grounded. Yet in the film, the Chinese are reduced to background extras, while Wayne and company hog the spotlight. Worse, it oversimplified combat into a Saturday matinee fantasy, where Japanese planes fall like flies, and American courage conquers all. The propaganda was deliberate. Released in 1942, the movie's mission was to drum up patriotic fervor and simplify a complicated war into clear-cut good guys and bad guys. It worked as morale-boosting entertainment, but at the cost of accuracy. Historians later pointed out how it distorted the real dynamics of the Sino-Japanese conflict, making it look as though America single-handedly carried the burden. Flying Tigers became a box office hit, but it left behind a legacy of myth. It honored American volunteers, but disrespected Chinese allies, turning a joint struggle into a solo act. In chasing spectacle, the film rewrote the truth of a partnership that deserved recognition. A Guy Named Joe, 1943. Sometimes, Hollywood doesn't just sanitize war, it floats right out of it. Victor Fleming's A Guy Named Joe is less about combat and more about romance, with a supernatural twist. Spencer Tracy plays a dead American pilot who, instead of passing on, returns as a ghostly mentor to a younger flyer. It's sentimental, patriotic, and loaded with wartime spirit. But it trivialized the Pacific theater into a backdrop for fantasy melodrama. The idea of fallen airmen guiding others from beyond the grave gave audiences comfort in 1943. The problem? It came at the cost of truth. Actual Pacific air campaigns were brutal, with staggering casualties, desperate missions, and grinding exhaustion. Instead of facing that reality, the movie wrapped loss in soft-focus Hollywood optimism. Even the flying sequences leaned more on spectacle than reality, with improbable stunts and sanitized depictions of air combat. Meanwhile, the romance angle consumed the story, turning battlefields into stages for love triangles rather than strategies of survival. Soldiers and airmen became symbols, not humans, convenient pieces in a glossy wartime fable. Yes, a guy named Joe boosted morale, but it also set a dangerous precedent, turning war into myth so palatable that it no longer resembled war at all. It's no wonder Steven Spielberg remade it decades later, as always, proving the fantasy endured, even as the real history slipped further away. Objective Burma, 1945. If you want to see how Hollywood can anger an entire ally, look no further than Objective Burma. Starring Errol Flynn, the movie portrays an elite American unit bravely taking on the Japanese in the jungles of Burma. Thrilling, right? Except the actual Burma campaign was fought largely by the British and Commonwealth forces, with Americans playing a limited role. The British government was so outraged by the movie that it banned it outright from UK theaters. The film presented Americans as the sole liberators, erasing the sacrifices of British, Indian, African, and Burmese troops who endured the grinding nightmare of jungle warfare. Veterans who had fought in the real campaign were disgusted, seeing their blood and sweat stolen for Hollywood's feel-good fantasy. The distortions didn't end there. Flynn's character engages in jungle heroics that had little to do with the actual slow, grinding, disease-ridden campaign. The Burma front was defined by exhaustion, monsoon rains, and supply line nightmares, not by movie-ready adventure. Objective Burma wasn't just inaccurate, it was insulting. By pretending the campaign was an American triumph, the film rewrote Allied cooperation into American exceptionalism. It's remembered today not for its action, but for its audacity, one of the clearest examples of Hollywood's willingness to overwrite allies with its own stars. Midway, 1976. The Battle of Midway was one of the most decisive victories in the Pacific, but you wouldn't know it from the 1976 film Midway. Instead of presenting the clash as the nail-biting, intelligence-driven gamble it really was, the film gave audiences a clunky soap opera stuffed with family drama and recycled stock footage. A turning point in world history turned into afternoon television with airplanes. The film's biggest sin was its reliance on existing combat reels spliced into the narrative, which created glaring visual inconsistencies. You'd see one shot of authentic planes, then suddenly cut to Hollywood sets with actors delivering stiff dialogue. The constant back-and-forth killed immersion. Worse, the characters were paper-thin. The film wasted Charlton Heston, Henry Fonda, and Toshiro Mifune on melodramatic side plots, rather than focusing on the razor's-edge intelligence work and naval strategy that decided the battle. It was less about breaking codes and more about breaking hearts. Hardly the story Midway deserved. Critics at the time recognized it as spectacle over substance. Veterans grumbled that the battle was treated with little of the respect or accuracy it deserved. Today, it stands as proof that even with a great subject, Hollywood can fumble the ball by chasing easy thrills. Midway wasn't just disappointing. It was a missed opportunity to honor one of the war's most pivotal moments. Pearl Harbor, 2001. If you need a perfect example of Hollywood at its worst, look no further than Pearl Harbor. Michael Bay's blockbuster tried to balance a love triangle with one of America's darkest days, and failed spectacularly at both. Instead of focusing on the horror, chaos, and resilience of December 7, 1941, the film drowned itself in glossy melodrama and special effects. The attack itself is rendered as a CGI extravaganza. complete with improbable stunts and explosions staged for maximum visual punch. But it's the human story that gets butchered. Real sailors, soldiers, and civilians are pushed aside so that Ben Affleck and Josh Hartnett can fight over Kate Beckinsale in a story that feels more like a soap opera than a war epic. The inaccuracies pile up. Japanese strategy is simplified into cartoon villainy. American response is depicted as clean and decisive when it was anything but. Survivors criticize the film for turning their trauma into spectacle, stripping away the gravity of the event for blockbuster thrills. Pearl Harbor is often compared to Titanic, only with bombs instead of icebergs. But the difference is stark. Titanic treated its tragedy with gravitas. Pearl Harbor turned one of America's greatest tragedies into popcorn entertainment. For that, it deserves every bit of criticism it still receives. So there you have it. 15 World War II movies Hollywood should be ashamed of. They bent history, erased allies, and turned tragedy into entertainment. But here's the bigger question. When Hollywood rewrites the past, what happens to the truth? Maybe the most dangerous battle isn't fought with bombs or bullets, but with stories. Which of these films shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit subscribe, and keep the conversation alive.